Let me ask you a question. Why do we call certain works of art classics? The term classic is often used to refer to media of outstanding quality, ones that have withstood the test of time and weathered countless criticism. But despite the formal definition, people use this word all the time to describe media that they simply enjoy. So clearly there's a subjective element to the word. Perhaps it's dependent on how a work of art makes us feel, or maybe it's when the heart of the author can be felt throughout the work itself. Whichever way you slice it, there's some sort of immeasurable element about a classic that seems to transcend critique. An obvious example is probably something like Oblivion or Skyrim. Objectively, these games are an 8 out of 10 at best. The quests and character writing leave a lot to be desired when compared to other games, and Skyrim especially was stripped of a lot of mechanical depth that was present in Oblivion, which itself stripped a lot of stuff from Morrowind. Yet because of the lore and the open world, many gamers still consider these to be classics. When it comes to horror though, there's quite a few stories that I personally define as classics. I'm obviously biased towards the original Jeff the Killer's stories in spite of their quality, and both Marble Hornets and the Morgue Files each hold a special place in my heart. The first two VHS films are probably some of my favorite horror movies alongside Lake Mungo and American Psycho, and I'm rather nostalgic towards horror games like Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Slender: The Arrival, and Silent Hill 2. But among all the horror media I've consumed up until now, none of them have really stuck with me like the Ben Drowned creepypasta. For anyone who didn't grow up during the 2000s and 2010s, Ben Drowned is a collection of YouTube videos linked to a series of 4chan posts. It tells the story of a user named Jedusible, who acquires a sketchy-looking copy of The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. And what follows as Jedusible shares his account with the internet is nothing short of terrifying. Ben Drowned, along with stories like Marble Hornets, essentially laid the groundwork that would be copied and iterated on by later unfiction projects. And Ben Drowned specifically has its DNA in a lot of creepypastas, such as NES Godzilla, Sonic.exe, and Petscop. Though despite its legacy, the story itself is rather quaint. It's full of a ton of moments that would become cliches in the gaming creepypasta genre. And for reasons we'll get into later, the story would only get worse as it continued. But even so, I can't help but call this story a classic. Why is that? Why does this story hold so much significance to me and many others? Is it purely nostalgia, or is there something more? So naturally, the only solution that made sense to me was to make another YouTube video. I'm never beating the H-Bomber guy allegations. In this video, I'll be thoroughly deconstructing Ben Drowned in an attempt to better understand its story and the impact that it had on internet horror. We'll go through the history leading up to Ben Drowned, the contents of the story itself, potential inspirations that played a hand in the story's creation, the cultural stranglehold that it had on the internet during its time, and how the story sort of became too big for its own good. And by the end of this, we'll wrap things up, come away with what truly makes something a classic, and explain why this story both does and doesn't qualify as one. But before we begin, make sure to like the video and hit the notification bell to get updates on... What the fuck?
What if I just throw this into a crowd of people?
Before we can delve into Ben Drowned, we first need to talk about Majora's Mask, since it's the glue that holds the story together. After the release of Ocarina of Time, Nintendo was busy at work creating a new Zelda project known as Zelda. The idea was that it would have taken the content from Ocarina of Time and remixed it into a whole new experience. In theory, this could have saved Nintendo a lot of time and money, and given Nintendo's current design philosophy, yeah, that checks out. But behind the scenes, there wasn't a lot of confidence in this project. According to an Iwata-esque interview, Eiji Aonuma, a lead director on many Zelda projects, explains that he wasn't very excited working on Zelda. He wanted to produce a new Zelda game with its own story, so Miyamoto gave him an offer. He would let Aonuma make a full-fledged Zelda title, but under the condition that it had to be finished within a year. Aonuma agreed, and the rest is history. While Zelda would be scaled down and rebranded as Master Quest, a lot of the content made for Zelda was moved to a project known as Zelda Gaiden, which would later morph into Majora's Mask. A major goal of Majora's Mask was to recontextualize a lot of what players knew about the Zelda franchise. The reason for this was because the game had to reuse a lot of assets present in Ocarina of Time in order to get the game out in a short time span. So the premise and story had to do a lot of the heavy lifting. There's many aspects of Majora's Mask that set it apart from Ocarina of Time, such as the setting of Termina or the 3D gameplay loop. But the most striking difference is undoubtedly the tone of the story. Many players have noted over the last 25 years that Majora's Mask is rather dark. Obviously, the moon falling is a pretty big example of this, but there's other dark elements sprinkled throughout the story and its different quests. You've got the aliens of Romani Ranch, the wedding between Anju and Kafei, the death of the Deku Butler's son, the story of Pamela and her father. I could go on. Overall, the story is without a doubt the game's greatest strength, and it's why people still look fondly on this game so many years later. But unfortunately, it just wasn't enough to outperform Ocarina of Time. Majora's Mask would hit store shelves in April of 2000 in Japan, October of 2000 in the US, and November of 2000 in the EU. During its lifetime on the N64, it would only manage to sell a little over 3 million copies, which is less than half of what Ocarina of Time sold. The difference is even more pronounced when you add the 3DS ports into these sales figures. Whereas Ocarina's combined sales put it only a few million units under Tears of the Kingdom, it took an entire remake on the 3DS for Majora's combined sales to catch up to the N64 version of Ocarina. But despite rather underwhelming sales, the game would eventually reach cult status and form a devout group of fans. A group of fans that were primed for a good scare. On September 7th, 2010, a post would grace 4chan's X board by the user Jaduzable. Okay, X, I need your help with this. This isn't copypasta, this is just a long read, but I feel like my safety or well-being could very well depend on this. This is video game related though, specifically Majora's Mask, and this is the creepiest shit that has ever happened to me in my entire life. What followed was an account of how Jaduzable acquired a shabby copy of Majora's Mask. According to him, he found the cartridge at a garage sale and it was given to him for free. Thinking nothing of it, he accepted the creepy old man's offer and took the game home. Before leaving, the man smiled at me and wished me well, saying what I assumed was goodbye then. At least that's what it sounded like to me. All the way on the car ride home, I had a nagging doubt that the man had said something else. And my fears were confirmed when I booted up the game. There was one save file simply named Ben. "Goodbye, Ben," he was saying. "Goodbye, Ben." I felt bad for the man, obviously a grandparent and obviously going senile, and I, for some reason or another, reminded him of his grandson Ben. Initially, Jaduzable tried to leave the file alone out of respect of its original owner. But after some annoying glitches that caused their names to swap during dialogue, the author made the innocuous decision to delete Ben's save in the hope that it would solve his problem. It did and it didn't. Now NPCs wouldn't call me anything. Where my name should be in the dialogue, there was just a blank space, although my save file was still called blank. Frustrated and with homework to do, I put down the game for a day. So, right off the bat, there's quite a few cliches regarding the story and its setup. The game was loaded onto a standard gray N64 cartridge with a ripped-off label and the name Majora written on it in black Sharpie, which looks nothing like the original cartridge. And it was in the possession of a strange old man at a garage sale in the middle of bumfuck suburbia. For horror junkies like myself, this should have been an immediate red flag that the story was pure fiction. However, I do have to admit that despite the formulaic setup, it still pulls off the intended effect quite well. The old man feels unnerving in the short amount of time we get to see him. And for a casual internet user in 2010, Jaduzable's reaction and naive optimism feels rather believable. And I do want to note that for the rest of its run on 4chan, the story manages to maintain this level of quality. For every cliche or horror trope that the story pulls out of its hat of tricks, Ben Drown makes up for it through the adequate execution of its ideas. After putting down the game for a bit, Jaduzable returns and attempts to perform what is known as the fourth day glitch. Essentially, it's an exploit in the game that removes the game's time limit and allows you to take your time with any dungeons or quests. However, upon performing the glitch, the game begins to act abnormal. When I pressed B to exit the telescope, instead of being greeted by the astronomer, I found myself in the Majora's boss fight room at the end of the game. staring at Skull Kid hovering above me. There was no sound, it was just him floating in the air above me in the trippy boxed arena, the creepy background music still playing like usual. Immediately my palms began to sweat. This was definitely not normal. Skull Kid never appeared here. What followed was a series of random glitches and occurrences that would end up transporting Deducible to what could only be described as a Twilight Zone version of Clocktown. All the NPCs were gone, Link's items and max health had been randomized, and the town music had been replaced with a reversed version of a track from the game called the Song of Healing. It was around this point that Deducible knew nobody would believe his story if he didn't have any sort of proof, so he set up what I presume was a capture card and began to record his footage onto his computer. What you're seeing right now is the video that caused this story to skyrocket into internet stardom. This is Dave4.wmv. To say this video is popular would be an understatement. There are more views on this video than there are copies sold of the original Majora's Mask. But even if you were to ignore the hype and or nostalgia surrounding Ben Drowned, the video itself is creepy in its own right. Like, what the hell is that thing? And oh Jesus, it's following me! So after getting virtually butt-fucked by a haunted N64 cartridge, the game restored Ben's save file and replaced Deducible's save with what can only be described as a gentle thread. It was at this point that Deducible took the footage he had recorded and wrote his first post on 4chan. I'm terrified of this game, even more so now that I've had to relive it a second time writing this all down. But I feel like there's still more to it than meets the eye, and that there's something calling to me to investigate this further. I'm going to stay in this thread for a little while longer before I fall asleep to answer any questions you guys might have. Hopefully you have some ideas or theories that can help shed some light on this, or maybe you even have ideas on things I should try to do. I think I'm going to play Ben's file tomorrow to see what happens. Maybe I was supposed to do that all along. I don't believe in paranormal shit. I do think this is a little fucked up, but maybe this Ben guy was just a really good hacker or programmer. I don't want to think about the alternatives if he wasn't. So this is the point in the video where I would have shown the user reactions to the original 4chan thread. But to my fucking dismay, it appears that Deducible's posts on X are considered lost media. God damn it. Inuna on the Lost Media Wiki left a forum post laying out what's currently missing, and from the looks of it, there hasn't been any work yet to try and recover any of this. I've gone ahead and left a link to this webpage in the pinned comment, as well as I sent this information to L Supersonic Q around the beginning of May when I first found out about this. As for my thoughts on the story so far, I do like how Deducible more or less plays along with the audience and allows them to feel like they're a part of the story. I can only imagine what it was like to observe Ben drown while it was ongoing. The closest thing to this that I've experienced was probably Petscop. A big difference though is that the internet during this period of time was a lot more whimsical compared to now. Part of what made Petscop so impressive was that it had to solve a lot of the problems present in Ben Drown, and it had to win over an audience that was highly accustomed to video game creepypastas. By comparison, the internet in 2010 hadn't really experienced anything like this on such a large scale. So when Ben Drowned and Marble Hornets hit the scene, they each offered a level of user participation that wasn't seen before on the internet outside of corporate projects. Beyond that, the showmanship on display can't be understated. The presentation is easily the story's strongest suit, and it's something that even Petscop struggled to compete with. A day would pass before Deducible would return with his first follow-up post. Sorry it took me so long, guys. I'm back. I'm gonna post what happened and link the video footage, but last night everything got too real for me. I think I'm done messing around with this.
He was not done messing around with this.
I passed out pretty much immediately after making that thread, but last night the Elegy of Emptiness statue, I had a dream about it. I dreamt that it was following me in my dream, that I'd be minding my own business when I'd feel my neck hair stand up on end. I would turn around and that horrible lifeless statue would be staring with those empty eyes right at me, mere inches away. In my dream, I remember calling it Ben, and never before have I had a dream that I could so vividly remember. But the important thing is I did get some sleep, I suppose. In this post, Deducible first explains how he went to look for the old man. To nobody's shock, the old geezer had completely disappeared. Deducible learns from a member of the neighborhood that he was apparently moving houses, which would explain the garage sale at the beginning of the story. Finally, Jujuzable works up the courage to ask who Ben is.
The man's expression turned grim, and I learned that 4 doors down around 8 years ago on April 23rd, there was an accident with a young boy named Ben in the neighborhood. Despite any further attempts to talk to the man to get more information, he wouldn't divulge anything else.
Returning home with more questions than answers, Jujuzable would start up his capture card and boot up the game. He began recording what would later become ben.wmv, and after a long pause, selected Ben's save file. In this video, there's 3 major points I want to focus on specifically. First, I think it's interesting that the game reacted the way it did when Jujuzable played the Song of Healing. It's well known in both horror fiction and religious circles that rituals and items of power can be used to ward off spirits. Given the suspicions the audience has regarding the cartridge, it only helps to confirm that the game is indeed haunted. Secondly, there's the repeated usage of areas related to water. You have the instance of the Zora Link drowning in the video, and while not shown explicitly in day4.wmv, Jujuzable describes trying to run to the laundry pool in an attempt to drown himself. This is completely headcanon, but I like to believe that the game is influencing Jujuzable's mind to some extent. It would also explain why he hasn't gotten rid of the cartridge, and it provides context for some of his actions later in the story. We learn later in the story that Jujuzable is just a mere college student, so it's not like he's someone who's mentally prepared to be corrupted by a haunted video game. Finally, there's the title card of Dawn of a New Day after the elegy statue appears in the Stone Tower Temple. What I find interesting about this is that it's the first instance in the story where it appears without any lines underneath the title card, and the reason I find it interesting is because it happens on Ben's save file. I believe that this moment is meant to be symbolic. It's the point in the story where Jujuzable, whether he realizes it or not, essentially lets Ben into his life. The action is akin to inviting a vampire into your home, and it's why I think Ben's actions continue to escalate throughout the rest of the story. After another series of traumatizing events, Jujuzable was brought back to the title screen. Mustering up all his courage, he finally pressed start.
The 2 save files told me his fate. As I suspected, Ben was dead. He had drowned. The game obviously isn't through with me. It taunts me with new save files. It wants me to keep playing. It wants me to go further. But I'm done with this shit. I'm not touching any more of the files. This is already way too horrifying for me, and I don't even believe in the paranormal. But I'm running out of explanations. Why would somebody send me this message? I don't understand it. I get too depressed thinking about this. Look, the footage is up here for those who want to see it and analyze it. I'm trying to get a hold of the camera so I can take a picture of the cartridge, but I have a feeling that once I do that, then those same people will not be content with having an unexplainable event and will then want me to jump through more hoops for proof. I promise you that I will, but just for the rest of the day, I want to distance myself from this thing and recuperate. I'll answer all of your questions and give you all the pictures I can tomorrow.
And with that, the second post comes to an end. Now, obviously, I can't give any input on the 4chan thread itself, but something I want to note is that it feels like Jujuzable is tweaking the story on the fly in order to meet the questions and expectations of his live audience. The level of planning and commitment that went into this performance was unreal, especially by early internet standards. Jujuzable would make his third post on September 10th, 2 days after his previous one. This post is rather small compared to the previous 2. We discover that Jujuzable played the Elegy of Emptiness, a song in the game used to produce the Elegy statue, at the first prompt he was given, and that doing so only left him worse for wear. He laments in this post about wanting his old life back, about wanting to retreat to his old comfortable life, but we in Jujuzable know that this is wishful thinking.
He's following me now, not just in the game, he's in my dreams. I see him all the time, behind my back, just watching me. I haven't gone to any of my classes. I've stayed in my dorm room with the windows closed and the blinds shut. That way I know he can't watch me. But he still gets me when I play. When I play, he can still see me. The game is scaring me now. It talked to me for the first time. Not just using text that's already in the game, it spoke to me. It talked to me. It referenced Ben, it talked to me. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what it wants. I never wanted this. I just want my old life back. My original game file is back though, just the way I left it before it was gone. But I don't want to play anymore. I feel like something bad will happen if I don't, but that's impossible. It's a video game. Haunted or not, it can't hurt me, right? Like, seriously though, it can't, right? That's what I keep telling myself, but every time I think about it, I'm not so sure.
Accompanied with this brief post is another 6-minute video titled drown.wmv, which I've been playing on screen. So there's quite a bit to unpack in this video, and we'll go over it point by point. First off is the inner world of the moon. In the context of Majora's Mask, the truth of this world is sort of left to interpretation. The only thing that can really be discerned is that the world is a product of the mask itself. Normally there's quite a few inhabitants playing in the field, and each of them bear either Majora's Mask or the mask of the temple bosses. But when Judiciable is summoned here, it's completely deserted aside from Link and Ben. It's possible that this may be representative of Ben's inner world, and his exchange with Judiciable hints at Ben's more playful nature. This is supported by the line, "You will be given one last chance." It's at this moment that a reader can discern that Ben is screwing with Judiciable, which transitions neatly to my next point. Secondly, there's the ending of the video. Before it ends, we discover that the game had restored both Ben and Judicible's original save files to the way they were before this all started. This gesture is akin to a carrot on a stick, an incentive for Judiciable to keep playing the game despite his better judgment. It's obvious at this point that Judiciable is on the verge of cracking, and that the game isn't holding back in its attempts to break him. But the most mind-boggling thing here is without a doubt the levels from Ocarina of Time. Not only do we see Link in the Happy Mask shop, but also the castle courtyard. This shouldn't be possible. While some objects from Ocarina of Time are present in the game's files, such as Princess Ruto, areas like Hyrule Castle and the Happy Mask shop aren't in the game whatsoever. In the context of the story, it shows that Ben has a lot more power than he lets on. Overall, it's easy to see why Judiciable took 2 days to get back to 4chan with his findings. I can only imagine what direction the story will go in next. While we're on the topic of Ocarina of Time, this would be a good opportunity to take a short intermission and tackle what other projects the story was inspired by. There aren't a lot of interviews with Alex Hall, the creator of Ben Drowned, that we can refer to in this section. The two most prominent ones are the 2017 Kotaku interview and the 2020 Arcade Attack interview posted on their YouTube channel. There's also a 2017 article on the Arcade Attack website, but it's pretty surface level. I won't be going over Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time again in this section. Alex is clearly a huge fan of the Zelda franchise, and if you haven't picked up on that by now and need to be spoon-fed this shit, then you're better off watching Source Brew's video instead. Aside from those two games, there's actually quite a few points of inspiration that have either been confirmed or referenced. The first is War of the Worlds, which was specifically stated by Alex in the 2020 interview. For those unaware, War of the Worlds was a radio broadcast about an alien invasion that aired in 1938. It was directed by Orson Welles, and the story was played entirely straight. It's often considered the first ever unfiction project, and it basically caused a national panic. I also wouldn't be shocked if Ghostwatch or the Blair Witch Project had some sort of influence on Alex, but they're never directly referenced in either of these interviews. Secondly, there was the Elegy statue itself. The character had become something of a meme during the 2010s, similar to the Jeff the Killer image. According to the 2020 interview, Alex believed there was horror potential for this character, and it's what gave birth to the idea of Ben. Another notable story directly mentioned in the 2020 interview was the creepypasta JVK116xz.esp. If you're unfamiliar with this story, you can listen to it here on my channel. But to summarize, JVK is about a peculiar Morrowind mod. The story tells a tale of a player who shares his recollection of the mod before transitioning to the account of a friend, who, through email correspondence, details further findings about the mod before disappearing off the face of the planet. Personally, I'm unsure whether Judiciable actually used it as inspiration, but I can definitely see the parallels between the two stories. While this isn't relevant yet, I do want to note that Marble Hornets also had an influence on the later half of the story. Alex talks about how he wanted to shoot some live-action footage to pay homage to those old Slender-Man videos, and from the sound of it, he had a lot of fun working on that portion of the story. We'll come back to this part later. Alex Hall also directly cites the Kill Switch urban legend as a point of inspiration in the 2017 Kotaku interview. For those unaware, Kill Switch was a supposed game that would delete itself after the players received a game over, all while preventing itself from being reinstalled. It, along with Polybius, are among some of the earliest examples of gaming creepypastas. Finally, the aesthetic of Alex's videos were inspired by old Game Shark cartridges. Are Game Sharks still a thing? God, I feel fucking old. So basically, Game Sharks along with action replays were these middleman devices that would run between your game and console. They were used to produce cheat codes for your games, and they did this by altering incoming data during runtime. These cards could basically do anything to your game, and a lot of modern emulators today are able to emulate a GameShark device through the use of a hexadecimal editor. So with these tools, Alex was able to make the game appear as though it was haunted. I think the biggest takeaway here is that Alex is clearly a creative person. He's without a doubt a true artist, and while his story ended up producing a lot of cliches in the gaming creepypasta genre, you still have to respect the work that went into it. On September 12th, the internet would be graced with the 4th entry of Ben Drowned, and with it came a surprising twist.
Let me just clear things up. I know you guys are worried, but Jujuceable is okay. He finished moving out today, and he said he's going back home. He's just taking this semester off. I'm not really sure what's happened. I have a vague idea, but you guys probably know more than I do. I'm Jujuceable's roommate, and I knew something was wrong with him for a few days now.
We learned that in the 2 days since his last post, Jujuceable had severed contact with all of his peers, was starving himself, and had been preparing some sort of final report for his roommate to give to the users on X. Along with that, Jujuceable's roommate explains that he was also given Jujuceable's final gameplay recording. He apologizes for cutting out a part of it at the beginning since he thought it wasn't important, and then uploaded the video for the internet to see. As for the contents of Jujuceable.wmv, well, let's just say we're gonna hold off on watching this until we've read the TXT file that Jujuceable had prepared. Just trust me on this, okay? The final post of Ben Drowned would arrive as promised by Jujuceable's roommate on September 15th, 2010, and alongside it was a download link for a file named thetruth.rtf. Wait, I thought it was supposed to be a TXT file. Well, whatever, it's probably just a formatting error. WordPad can be kind of weird like that.
Hey guys, Jujuceable here. This will be the last time you'll be hearing from me. And this is my final gift to you. These are the notes that I have taken and the realizations I've made. Before I delve into any of this, I want to thank you for following me and thank you for listening. It feels like the weight of a powerful burden is about to be lifted. By the time you read this, I won't be around anymore. But after spending 4 days with this maddening game, I have begun to understand what's really at play here, and hopefully after reading this we can ensure this never happens again.
What follows is a series of thoughts and notes left by Jujuceable before he disappeared entirely from the internet. Among these is a chilling exchange between Jujuceable and Ben, who communicated with him through an old chatbot site known as Cleverbot. He learns that Ben has made his way into Jujuceable's computer, and like any virus, he's essentially taken full control of his system.
What have I done? I've invited it into my computer. I continue to write these notes, write my summaries, but I feel like I'm a prisoner of my one place of security. I don't know. I don't know if I'm hallucinating or not. I feel like I'm fucking insane right now. I can feel it watching over me even as I type this. Ben is controlling everything in the game, toying with me, leading me like a sheep, but for what? What's the purpose? I know Ben drowned, but why these hauntings? What the fuck am I even doing? It can probably even see this right now.
After some further investigation, Jujuceable discovers a horrifying truth. Unbeknownst to him and the audience watching, we've basically been fed a doctored narrative of this story from presumably the beginning. Interestingly, Jujuceable made note of the Moon Children, and that mentions of them had been censored in ben.wmv. It's unknown why Ben omitted this information, and we won't learn about that for a while.
The Moon Children appeared in my dreams last night. They lifted up their masks to reveal their hideously disfigured faces. Maggots crawling out of their orifices, sunken black holes where their eyes should be. A yellow smile that slowly grew bigger and bigger as they came closer to me. They told me they wanted to play. I tried to run from them, but the 4 children pinned me down to the ground with surprising strength. Over them stood the Happy Mask salesman, announcing that he had a new mask that he wanted me to try. In his spastic, sudden movements matching his in-game appearance, he took out a mask modeled off of someone's face that I couldn't recognize, a younger-looking face, and handed it to the Moon Children. Giggling, they latched it to my face, their horrible, broken bodies bouncing up and down. 2 of them held me down while the other 2 began to sew the mask onto my face. My shrieks and screams caused the happy mask salesman's face to turn into the most horrific smile I'd ever seen. He sporadically moved around, examining this procedure like a curious doctor. I flailed around, but it was no use. My eyes rolled into the back of my head because of the pain. It felt so real, but I couldn't wake up. I couldn't wake up. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. After the mask melded onto my flesh, they began sewing my legs together, and then my arms. The horrific feeling of a needle puncturing your legs and pulling them in ruptured throughout my entire body. I tried to scream, but the mask was pressed so tightly against my face that I couldn't speak. I didn't make a sound. I tried telling myself in my head that I was dreaming. Tried telling myself again and again. And suddenly the Moon Children stopped and looked at me. They just stared. And the happy mask salesman slowly bent down and stared at me inches away from my face, and grinned as he simply said, "You've met with a terrible fate, haven't you?" Before the Moon Children resumed with increased vigor. I couldn't wake up. I couldn't wake up. It wouldn't let me wake up until they had crafted me into another elegy statue. I bolted upright, sweating, crying, and shaking uncontrollably.
Judiciable would continue to press Ben for answers, but would continue to receive none in response. Apparently, the information was reserved for someone else, and it was here where Judiciable would realize that his time was running short. What follows after is a full transcript of what happened during his playthrough of his final recording, matt.wmv. Wait, I thought his final video was Judiciable.wmv. After this, he warns everyone reading to ignore any future posts from him and to not download any of his videos, explaining that he doesn't want Ben to spread to their computers. And with that, he leaves us with his final message.
This 5th day will be my last day. I'm going to burn the cartridge and then come back to destroy my laptop. Even though I don't even know you, this is sort of bittersweet for me. This semester I really didn't have any friends. Or rather, I stopped paying attention to them. But I suppose I'm the one to blame because I'm the genius who decided to live in a single-room apartment. I suppose if someone was there to get a hold of me, they could have saved me before I got too immersed in all this. I'm just glad it happened to me and that I was able to get the warning out so that Ben dies here. Lastly, thank you for taking the time to open this and open yourselves up to me by hearing my story. Despite maybe not believing me. You didn't have to do that. Really, you shouldn't have. But your support this entire time has kept me going, and now I'm finally free of this. Thanks again.
Not too long after the release of this file, we would receive what would be the final video on Judiciable's channel for a very long time. In this 18-second video, Ben explains that the counter had been reset before presumably thanking the viewer. Well, that's bizarre. You would think that Ben would be more upset after Judiciable managed to thwart his plans, but perhaps we're missing something. I did think it was kind of weird that Judiciable, or I suppose Matt, had us download his journal after telling us not to download anything from him. Now that I think about it, Judiciable.wmv wasn't referenced anywhere in his notes. What's the deal with that? Well, I think I've made you all wait long enough. Without further ado, here is Judiciable.wmv. And with that, the story of Ben Drowned would come to a close. So there's a lot to unpack here. First off, it's unclear what exactly happened to Deducible after recording Matt.wmv. Personally, I always believed that he got himself trapped inside the cartridge. I figured that Matt was supposed to be Deducible, but for reasons we'll get into later, I will confirm now that they aren't the same people. Secondly, Deducible's journal confirms that there was never any roommate. Deducible.wmv was a doctored version of Matt.wmv uploaded by Ben, and the same is true for the Truth.rtf. The journal confirms that Ben is able to tamper with Deducible's computer, and after downloading the Truth.rtf, he was presumably able to take control of your computer as well. In fact, according to Alex in the 2020 interview, there was a man in Wichita after the release of the Truth.rtf who apparently unplugged his computer for over a week out of fear of it being haunted. I talked about this sort of thing before in my Jeff the Killer retrospective, but that's just the sort of effect that creepypastas had on people back then. There was never a disclaimer that the story was fiction. The entire point of creepypastas back in the day was to convince people that your stories were real. They were essentially modern-day campfire stories. Finally, I thought the Truth.rtf was an interesting twist that helped recontextualize the story up until this point. I kinda glossed over this during my overview, but the events depicted in Deducible's journal occurred between September 6th and September 12th. While I do think it's a little weird that Deducible was documenting this to begin with, it's possible that the Truth.rtf could have just been an excerpt from his personal journal. It's a little annoying though that the reader can't fully discern what parts of the story are true, but it wouldn't shock me if that was intentional on Alex's part. That being said, I don't think the ambiguity ruins the experience. Ben Drowned at the end of the day is a performance piece, and what we got felt incredibly authentic for the most part. The mixed media approach did a lot to immerse me into the story, and while it's not a major focus, the themes related to the struggles of becoming an adult resonated with me while I was working on this project. There's this line in the story about how he just wanted to go home and see his parents again. And while I wasn't ever in this exact position during my time in college, I can still empathize with this situation somewhat. Overall, the story of Ben Drowned left a lasting impact on the creepypasta community, and this could be felt in both the people who read it and the stories which chased its success. I'll try not to yap too much about the creepypasta fandom in this section. It without a doubt had a hand in both propagating and maintaining the longevity of the story, and much like many creepypastas of its time, the character of Ben wasn't immune to becoming teenage eye candy. However, it's clear that Ben Drowned had an easier time standing on its own compared to its contemporaries. Critical reception towards this story has always been generally positive, but it's hard to illustrate that without hard evidence given that this story is about 15 years old now. So for the sake of this video, I went back and glossed over the comments left on both the deducible reuploads, both of Mr. Creepypasta's narrations, the Night Mind 45-minute analysis, and Nextbo's retelling of Ben Drowned. The goal of this was to get a general idea of the community's consensus towards this story, and upon reading these comments, there's a few talking points that kept cropping up. First off, there's obviously a lot of commenters trying to score free internet points. The amount of guys that I've seen that have suggested blowing into the cartridge is pretty funny, and of course you've got people poking fun at Ben himself. It's not too dissimilar to the sort of goofy commentary seen among friends when watching a horror movie, and it's nice to know that people nowadays can still enjoy the story and have fun with it. Secondly, the atmosphere of this story is often cited as a strong suit. This is sort of a given. The reverse Song of Healing is debatably just as iconic as the original track, and I've already gushed enough about the techniques that went into producing the look of the story. After this are a few comments which blame the story for the oversaturation of video game creepypastas. And I mean, they're not wrong. There's a few creepypastas which predate it, such as Polybius, Tales Doll, and even Herobrine. But for the most part, a lot of gaming creepypastas from 2011 onwards owe their existence to Ben Drowned. On top of this, Ben Drowned and by extension Sonnet.exe are largely to blame for the rise of EXE horror games that plagued Let's Play channels during the early to mid 2010s, with the other major influence being the plethora of Pokemon creepypastas that cropped up around this time. These games greatly flooded this already oversaturated genre of online horror media, and it wasn't until the 1-2 punch of Five Nights at Freddy's and Pets Cop that people were able to warm up to this type of internet horror again. Finally, quite a few comments agree that this story is a classic creepypasta and a core part of the golden age of internet horror. Obviously, the story benefits a lot from being able to utilize and subvert iconography from both Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, but the story itself still manages to stand out through its premise and execution. It also helps that Ben isn't treated as anything bigger than just a ghost in the shell. For a haunted cartridge, it has quite a few rules and constraints that it has to adhere to that helps make the story feel rather grounded. The story's biggest strength, though, aside from its presentation, is the dynamic between Ben and Deducible. It's all but spelled out to the reader that Ben suffered the exact same fate as him, so you have that connection there. But on top of that, the use of the elegy statue is interesting when taking Link into account. After all, the statue is an object in the game that only Link can summon. It helps reinforce the fact that these are two people trying to outwit each other, and while Deducible is incredibly out of his depth, it makes their interactions rather engaging to observe. Overall, there's a lot that this story does right. Whether it's weaponizing the reader's nostalgia, or scaring the viewers with diegetic jump scares, all these elements come together to create a wholly unique experience. However, the creepypasta itself is only part of its success. To get the full picture, we need to talk about the works inspired by Ben Drowned. So as I said previously, you could say that a lot of creepypastas owe their existence to Ben Drowned, but the most notable copycats are without a doubt NES Godzilla, Sonnet.exe, and Petscop. We'll go over each of them briefly, starting with NES Godzilla was basically my introduction to the Godzilla franchise, so to say I'm biased towards this story would be a gross understatement. Much like Ben Drowned, NES Godzilla follows the account of a man who got his hands on a haunted copy of the NES game Godzilla Monster of Monsters. The story itself is pretty overrated when looking at it through a critical lens, but much like Ben Drowned, you have to respect the work that went into its presentation. Red's design is nothing short of iconic, and the images do a good job of imitating the look of a glitched NES game. What I will say about the story is that I like the level of detail that went into describing the scenery, boss fights, and chase sequences. However, this story does have a twist midway through that feels incredibly half-assed. It completely undermines the believability of this creepypasta, and it just utterly ruins the tone of the story. Overall, NES Godzilla was kind of a blip compared to the total phenomenon that was Ben Drowned. We wouldn't really see any sort of these copycats reach the same level of fame until Sonic.exe. So, much like the Sonic franchise in general, the history of Sonic.exe is incredibly convoluted. I would actually recommend watching the insane story behind Freaky Sonic by Wallace Prower if you want a full breakdown of this character, because it more or less covers the entire story of Sonic.exe leading up to that point. But as for the story itself, it details the account of a person who received a CD and a note from his friend warning him not to open the game on the disc. Which is just... Why would his friend leave the CD on his doorstep if he doesn't want him to look at it? I don't... What? After popping in the CD, our protagonist finds a seemingly innocuous ROM of Sonic the Hedgehog for the Sega Genesis labeled Sonic.exe. Thinking nothing of it, he opens the game and all hell begins to break loose. So I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This story is bad. Like, worse than Clockwork bad, which is a fucking accomplishment in and of itself. Like, at least Clockwork had sort of a reason to be this awful. I was unaware of this at the time when I wrote the Jeff the Killer retrospective, but Clockwork was apparently some sort of trauma dump story on the part of the author, which kinda puts into perspective why it reads sort of like a power fantasy. It's because of this that I'd like to issue an apology to the author of Clockwork. I should have been more respectful when criticizing your story. I didn't know how much of yourself was written into your character. I'm sorry you had to go through this shit. Sonic.exe, on the other hand, has no real excuse to fall back on. It's not only a ripoff of Ben Drowned, but also the Tails Doll Curse. The story itself doesn't really try to do anything original, and the only reason it even blew up was because it had a game attached to the story that a bunch of Let's Players jumped onto. If PewDiePie and Markiplier had never played this game, this story would have just faded into obscurity. It maybe would have seen moderate success within the Sonic fandom, but it would have never reached its initial spike in popularity, and it wouldn't have ever been thrown into a Friday Night Funkin' mod. Overall, this story is just fucking garbage, and while I understand why Sonic.exe has a certain appeal among kids and teenagers, none of that can be used to defend the quality of the story itself. Thankfully, none of this really applies to our third and final copycat. To say that Petscop was iconic would be an understatement. It would be an understatement to say that established news outlets were calling this story the king of creepypasta. It would be an understatement to say that Petscop was the second wind for a form of storytelling that was growing stale and oversaturated, and it helped lay the foundation for what would later become digital horror. It would be an understatement to say that Petscop was the big break for many up-and-coming YouTube channels, and it would be an understatement to say that Pyrocynical owes his current success to this story. The impact that both Petscop and Local 58 had on internet horror can still be felt to this day, and it is without a doubt a classic creepypasta. The first episode of Petscop was published on March 12, 2017, and over the span of 2 years, we would receive a total of 24 uploads. The story follows a guy by the name of Paul who records and uploads a series of Let's Plays showing off a strange game that he found. The videos themselves are directed at some unnamed friend of his, and after following a series of instructions that came with the game, he essentially opens Pandora's box and is left to explore the secret inner world of Petscop. Petscop is full of literary allusions to both works of fiction and real-world events, and as the story progresses, Paul slowly grows more and more uncomfortable with everything that he finds. The influence that Ben Drowned had on this story is pretty much clear as day, but the way it was told among with the wholly unique content surrounding its story helped give Petscop a level of authenticity that was unlike anything that had ever been seen at the time. It's essentially what Kane Pixel's Backroom series was to Marble Hornets. This story is easily a classic that stands beside the greats of the online horror space. And that brings us back to our thesis. What exactly makes something a classic? Well, perhaps the key factor among all else is influence. Ben Drowned, regardless of its flaws, holds some sort of cultural importance in the online horror space. It dared to be different during a time when video game creepypastas were mostly written like urban legends, and the level of commitment and artistic direction helped to really define the look and feel of this story. This is a quality that's shared among a lot of classic stories, and it's clear that they all hold up well even today. But even still, I feel like this definition is missing something. Like I said in the beginning of the video, I believe it's fair to call objectively awful stories classics, which just doesn't fit this definition whatsoever. Regardless of how you feel about a story like Jeff the Killer, Clockwork, or Sonic.exe, They're each iconic stories in the creepypasta space for one reason or another. Well, what if I told you that the answer to this problem lies in Ben Drowned? What if I told you that not only is the story far from over, but in fact, it was only just getting started? For the longest time, I was under the impression that Ben Drowned ended with the truth.rtf and the video that accompanied it. It was a neat conclusion that tied up enough loose ends without answering every single question, which is something that a simple horror story like this should try to strive towards. But unbeknownst to me and many others, the story of Ben Drowned continued for years after its initial run on 4chan and YouTube, and this occurred in the form of an ARG known as the Moon Children arc, along with a fourth wall breaking story known as the Awakening arc. We'll be going over these in extensive detail, so if you haven't seen or read them yourself, now is your last chance to check it out before I tear into these. Much like the original 4chan threads, the websites that hosted the second arc of Ben Drowned are completely lost today. However, much of the events that occurred on these websites have been recorded and preserved on the Deducible Wiki, which is what I'll be referring to for this portion of the video. Much like many of you watching, I'll be going into this section of the story for the first time. I do apologize if my analysis isn't as sharp as the first half of this video. I haven't had years to reflect on any of this. The Moon Children arc takes place on two websites. You Shouldn't Have Done That.net and a later forum site known as Within Hubris. The first website is completely gone, and the URL for the second redirects to a hentai website. I wish that was a joke. The Moon Children arc would begin on September 17th, 2010, 2 days after the release of the truth.rtf. In hindsight, it's rather shocking that this flew under the radar of so many people, though to be fair, most people have read this story through other people's narrations. It may have just gotten lost in translation. Deducible, the channel not the character, first began by providing a list of coded messages in his recent activity log on YouTube. For those who don't know, YouTube used to offer a lot of customization options for your channel, and among those was an activity log which would show your viewers the recent changes made to your channel. Honestly, I wish Google would bring back a lot of these features, but I guess that's too much to ask for from a multi-billion-dollar company. When the messages were deciphered, they left breadcrumbs that brought players of the ARG to the URL of the You Shouldn't Have Done That website, which we'll abbreviate as YSHDT for simplicity's... God, that doesn't sound good either. How about You Shit? Yeah, let's go with that. You Shit, as it turned out, was a website dedicated to a cult known as the Moon Children, the name being a reference to the inner world in Majora's Mask. And from the looks of it, the site was still under development. A lot of the content here is kind of what you would expect from a French cult like this. You have a handful of members who have all ascended, whatever that means. Their goal seems to be about bringing the end of the world, which is in reference to the falling moon from Majora's Mask, and the main administrator of the site is named Drowned, a clear reference to the creepypasta. From an outsider looking in, it almost looks like the users are role-playing. If you haven't pieced it together yet, the missing Moon Children in Ben's copy of Majora's Mask were apparently foreshadowing this arc. However, things would quickly take on a more sinister note. During their investigation, players of the ARG would discover references to a moonchild by the name of Kelbris. Supposedly, Kelbris was the founder of the site. He was the first of the Moon Children, the first to have spoken to Luna, the moon that they worship, and the status of his ascension was unclear. However, as you'll see later, it appears that Kelbris is still an active force on the website. Upon later investigation, players of the ARG would come to learn that Ben was once a member of their cult as well, but the whereabouts of his body were unknown after his ascension. This of course brings into question the purpose of the haunted cartridge, but it also would explain why Ben is such a malevolent character. Aside from these two, there's a few other characters of note that we'll need to keep track of. The first is Rosa, which is in reference to an older video on Deducible's channel that predicted the events of the Ben Drowned creepypasta by over a year. The clip in question is from the game Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, and the character in the video is a Malkavian, a race of vampires that can see into the future. It's unclear whether or not this video was always intended to be a part of the Ben Drowned story, but a lot of the content in this video will be pretty relevant going forward. Beyond that, we also have a few moderators such as Ifrit, Neko, and Duskworld23. There's another member known as Alex, but he appears to be missing. So I want to take this moment to kind of posit a theory I have. I think Ben's cartridge may be a conduit used for this ascension ritual described by the cult. It would explain why his cartridge is so different, as well as it would explain how Ben ended up becoming trapped within it. But if that's true, then that begs the question, how many other conduits exist, and do the conduits have to be a copy of Majora's Mask? This is a small complaint, but we don't know what the Ascension ritual entails. I don't understand how the Majora's Mask cartridge plays into any of this yet, but I'm sure we'll receive an answer for this in due time. Why does that feel like foreshadowing? The next day, attempts will be made by users to try and get some information from Ifrit regarding Ben, Deducible, and the website. Among these attempts, a few bits of information were gathered. First off, we learn that Rosa is Ifrit's sister. Secondly, it's revealed that the cult members are trying to reunite with Luna. Third, it's discovered that the cult is made up of members exclusively in the United States. Yeah, that checks out. Fourth, the cult is apparently unaware of Majora's Mask and their connection to Deducible. And finally, there isn't a way to force yourself into the cult. You have to essentially be invited by one of the members. Later that day on YouTube, a video response to free.wmv would be uploaded by the user the missing link titled FJ6RT. For context, YouTube back in the day would allow you to directly reply to a video you watched with a video of your own, and those replies would show up on the webpage of the video being responded to. It was kind of like making a repost tweet on Twitter, and I imagine the reason this feature was removed was because it promoted harassment. Personally, I'm not too bothered by this feature being removed. Websites like Twitter are literally hell on earth. As for the video itself, it depicted Link in his adult form from Ocarina of Time, playing the Song of Time itself. And what followed after this could only be described as mind-boggling. After this video was posted, the site would go down and a repost of the truth.rtf would appear once more on 4chan. Once the shit came back online, it appeared as though progress of the site had been completely reverted. It was almost exactly like it was when they first found it, with the exception being that any mentions of Ifrit or Drown were missing. In Ifrit's place was a new moderator named Insidiae. Not too long after, another YouTube user by the name of that would post a video response of Link playing the inverted Song of Time inside his game of Majora's Mask. This prompted a response from Ben on Deducible's channel confirming that the input was accepted. And it was at this point that players began to understand the rules of the game. The website, for whatever reason, was able to be affected by songs from the Ocarina, and with that, the players began scrambling to be the first to try other songs. The first response after this discovery was from the user MFGref, who would respond with the song New Wave Bossa Nova. This was done in an attempt to bring back Ifrit, but instead it allowed players to communicate with Rosa. Further attempts using the Song of Healing and Oath of Order would go on to create negative effects, and from here, users began to scramble in an attempt to try and save the members of the cult. A user named Maya would again upload a video with the Song of Time, and once more the website had reset. Now Rosa was gone too. It was clear to players by now that there was something coming for each of the cult members. It was presumably either Ben or Kelbris given their reactions, and from the looks of it, Alex was next on the chopping block. Attempts would be made to keep Alex from succumbing to his fate by players uploading videos, but before Alex's fate could be determined, the ARG would receive the first of many roadblocks. Alex Hall, not to be confused with the character Alex, would make a statement that the ARG had been put on hold indefinitely due to financial troubles. This pause would last for only about 2 weeks due to donations he had received from members of the community. The ARG would resume on October 4th, 2010. Players would begin to piece together clues to a URL using pieces of text found on each page of Yashit. Many users assumed the URL spelled out whatisben.com, but at the time the webpage hadn't been released. 2 days later, an event would occur on the site which would be referred to as the glitch. Multiple assets would change on the site, and along with them were a collection of text files along with a cipher. Players would learn through these text files that the site was apparently in some sort of dream state, and based on information provided in the cipher, they were able to discover numerous other hidden files. After a few minutes of players scrambling to collect these hidden files, the website would reset back to the state it was on September 21st, and with it, the chat logs in the guest book had disappeared with it. For context, a guest book is basically a public chat room where guests on your website can leave public comments. It's basically the precursor of the comment feature that's present on a lot of social media websites and applications. After this, players would take this time to review the files that they had collected. They had all been password protected, but the players had managed to unlock all of them except for one. After some hints provided by the webmaster, players would manage to unlock the last file named mhftt.txt. The TXT file contained a message from Ifrit warning players to stay vigilant. It's unclear what has exactly happened to either Ifrit or Rosa for that matter, but apparently they aren't dead. Something of note is that throughout the message, there's points where sentences get cut off by seemingly unrelated blocks of text. When combining them together, it reads the following. Consider this the real truth.txt. What are you talking about? Along with this secret message were two ciphers. The first cipher apparently hasn't been properly solved by the community, but the second was deciphered almost immediately. And this is where things start to get complicated. The second cipher refers to a DeviantArt account owned by Cade Hendricks that went by the username Ryukaki. Supposedly, he was in some sort of danger, and players of the ARG would begin contacting Ryukaki directly to warn him about Ben. Now, the reason why this section of the story is complicated is because Cade was later accused by Alex Hall of derailing the ARG, and this incident sort of illustrates my biggest issue with this section of the story. The Moon Children arc is pretty messy. The reason why Ben Drowned felt believable during its run on 4chan and YouTube was because of its execution and authenticity. And while the ARG is nailing a lot of the execution, the story up until now has been rather aimless. Couple that with the fact that the Ben Drowned creepypasta already has a rather neat conclusion, and what you're left with here is a sequel that's struggling to justify its existence. What I think is really missing here is some sort of end goal for the players. This was something that Alex realized during the Awakening arc, but the Moonchildren arc would have had a lot more focus if there was a main character that the players were supporting. And personally, I think it should have been Rosa. Like, you can do this sort of story without a main character, but in that case, the villain needs to be driving the plot and directing the course of the story. Ben doesn't really do that. His goals are never really expanded beyond killing the members of the cult. There also would have been a lot more retention in the story if it were possible for players to save and protect members of the cult. Like, Ifrit's death could have been mandatory in order to illustrate Ben's capabilities, but it would have been more engaging if the players had saved Rosa and then were able to save other members going forward. I also think that Kelbris should have been the one responsible for the time loops instead of what I assume is Ben. I mean, he's a cult leader. The ARG setting would have afforded Alex the ability to deviate from the story's unfiction roots, so Kelbris could have just been some Lovecraftian villain. Overall, there's just a lot of untapped potential for this arc that could have made it a lot better. I do like this arc overall, but the story isn't on par with the original creepypasta. As for the Cade Hendricks situation, the Deducible Wiki has labeled his contributions to the story as ambiguously canonical, which is just... So to keep things sort of neat, I'm gonna try to speed through the rest of this so we can finally get to the Awakening arc. A fair amount of time would be spent communicating with Ryukaki through the use of a role-playing website before some of the players would begin to receive phone calls from a blocked number. The voicemails sent to these players were unintelligible, but they did contain excerpts from both the Elegy of Emptiness and the Reverse Song of Healing. Not too long after, Ryukaki would upload a set of videos reporting his own experience with these calls. These videos are each shot from a camcorder with his voice narrating his thoughts and reactions, and overall they document Ryukaki's final moments before he's finally caught by Ben. Not much substance is added to the story due to this character's inclusion beyond trying to get players further immersed into the ARG. All we really learn is that Ryukaki was targeted because he moved into the home that Ben died in. And while this is all really cliche, it is interesting to see how much power Ben has gained within the last month. A few months would pass before players would receive a URL in the form of binary code. The URL took players to the forum site Within Hubris, which at that point was definitely not a hentai website. Within Hubris was basically a waiting room for the ARG players, as Alex Hall made preparations for what would have been called the Hubris arc. Players would have experienced this arc through a standalone indie game, but it was cancelled after a year and the game never got past the alpha stage. Beyond that, the site also provided a recap of the story up until this point for people jumping into Ben Drowned for the first time. As for the alpha build of the game, it's bad. The entire level is incredibly dark, and your mouse cursor isn't even disabled during gameplay. The entire second floor is inaccessible, and I don't mean it's barred off or anything. I mean you literally fall through the floor if you try to walk up there. Aside from that, there's a few blocks you can interact with which provide test messages, and the pool behind the house causes you to fall into an endless abyss. Personally, I don't understand why Alex wanted to transition the story from an ARG into an indie game. The leap from creepypasta to ARG was already a huge transition for the story, but to then jump from an ARG to a video game is incredibly ambitious. It is worth noting though that around 2012, Slender the 8 Pages was dominating the online space. My assumption is that Alex saw all the Let's Players jumping onto the Slender-Man bandwagon and thought he could leverage a lot of that attention for his story. Overall, the cancelled Hubris arc goes to show how aimless the Ben Drowned story became around this point. Not too long after this, Alex Hall would put the ARG on an indefinite hiatus, and this would last for about 8 years. On March 17, 2020, Awakening.wmv would drop on the Deducible channel. With it came a binary code which translated to 32020. In 3 days, the Awakening arc would begin. The Awakening arc is nothing short of a fucking fever dream. On the one hand, it can be considered a return to form. Much of the videos involve clips of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, there's points in the story where players can affect the events of the video, and we even learn what happened to Judiciable. But on the other hand, there's a B-plot running beside the events which tell the tale of a man named Jadis, and they don't seem to be related to Judiciable or the cult whatsoever. Moreover, there's a lot of allusions in this B-plot to the COVID lockdowns, and the collapse of societal norms during that period of time. This will become relevant to the main plot later, but these excerpts mostly provide context for a choose-your-own-adventure portion of the story. What I do want to add real quick is that this post-apocalypse setting kinda comes out of left field and doesn't seem to have any direct connection to the cartridge or the cult. It was clearly a creative decision made in response to the COVID lockdowns, and I figure its inclusion in the story was Alex's way of coping with the political climate at the time. But in some regards, it's also an acknowledgement by Alex that the story had sort of lost the plot. In some regards, I can respect that, but it doesn't change how much of a clusterfuck this story has become. We'll come back to this all momentarily because things are only going to get weirder from here. As for the cult and haunted cartridge, the story of Awakening picks up where the haunted cartridge arc immediately left off. We learn that Judiciable was consumed by an eldritch being known as the Father after delving deeper into the cartridge's secrets, and from there the story shifts into a live-action medium in the future described by Jadis. And it's here where I feel like Ben Drowned begins to regain some of its original focus. The audience is given an opportunity to control a character in the story and make decisions on his behalf. He ultimately ends up dying on day 11 before another character takes his place and the audience assumes control of her. We're eventually introduced formally to Sarah, the girl that the audience has been piloting, and she eventually comes into contact with the haunted cartridge by a man named Abel. Sarah discovers through playing the game that the father has been masquerading as Ben the entire time, and that the real spirit of Ben has basically been locked away inside the cartridge. Sarah manages to play the Song of Healing, and what follows is utterly cathartic. Ben warns Sarah that it's only a matter of time before the father attempts to kill her as well. And in a final act of desperation, Ben, along with presumably Judiciable, bestow their energy into Sarah's game file. Through what can only be described as an anime transformation, we see Link somehow turn into his adult form from Ocarina of Time. After playing the Song of Time, Link is brought back to not only the first day, but back into the game as it existed in 2010. And just like that, the third act of this arc kicks into full gear. Sarah is sent on a wild goose chase at the behest of an NPC named Matt in order to begin freeing the souls trapped within the cartridge. She then comes into contact with Rosa, who provides her with the Pendant of Memories along with the light arrows. After taking out 4 different bosses, Sarah is pulled from her current location and is forced to fight a seemingly corrupted Judiciable. After running out of time due to her fight with him, Sarah is forced to perform the 4th day glitch in order to buy time so that the souls trapped in the cartridge can be freed. But as it turns out, this was all part of the father's plan. Matt, who in fact was Ifrit, reveals that he was working for the father the entire time, and the entire game begins to go to shit. Once more, Sarah confronts Judiciable and Ben, and through the aid of both Judiciable and the pendant given by Rosa, Sarah is able to withstand the influence of the father and bargain for the release of the souls trapped within the cartridge. But this is where things start to get weird again. So, running in the background of the main plot is a website known as the Eternity Project, and players of the ARG come to learn that the Moon Children cult was actually part of one big experiment. To grossly summarize, there was never a world-ending cult, and the father is basically an artificial intelligence based on Kelbris, the founder of the Eternity Project. The test subjects were led to believe that they were being ascended to some other plane, when in reality, their souls were being digitized and implanted into a copy of Majora's Mask. Sarah basically learns all of this from Judiciable, and the audience is supposed to piece together that Abel is also a member of the Eternity Project. Abel's place in the story is that of a neutral party, and he's only really interested in observing the fallout. According to the father, Rosa and the other Moon Children were freed from the cartridge and were returned to new sets of functional bodies due to Sarah's sacrifice. Sarah fades away along with Judicible's lingering spirit, and the simulation resets once more. And that's it, basically. The credits roll and Alex Hall thanks everyone who has stayed with this project until the end. And with that, the story of Ben Drowned draws to a close. Okay, I need to level with you guys. Throughout this video, I tried very hard to be charitable towards both the Moon Children arc and the Awakening arc. I mean, I grew up with Ben Drowned among countless other creepypastas, and while I overall liked the Moon Children arc, I can't say the same for the final chapter of this story. The Awakening arc is a complete clusterfuck, and unlike a series such as Kingdom Hearts or Five Nights at Freddy's, There wasn't a natural progression that brought the story to this point. The Awakening arc is a slap in the face to anyone who was invested in the Moon Children arc, because it's a complete retcon of that storyline. It's a cop-out, plain and simple. If you don't believe me, then let's take a step back and look at how we got here. Ben Drowned started as a tightly written horror story about a haunted cartridge. It was short, sweet, and to the point. And while elements of the story would end up becoming cliches in the creepypasta community, it was still a good story at the end of the day. Then after that, Ben Drowned took a major leap and became an ARG about a doomsday cult. It was a far cry from the more humble beginnings of the story, but for what it was worth, there were still a lot of interesting ideas and it wasn't too out of the realm of possibility. It at least felt like a natural progression. And this was because for all of its faults, Alex Hall managed to build an interesting mythos surrounding Ben and the other Moon Children. So to take that and then radically change everything again by introducing some shadowy organization that was using the cult as a front for a secret experiment is just... There's a lot of issues I have with this, but the biggest one is that it creates a lot of new plot holes that just didn't exist before. For example, it was already kind of weird that Deducible's parents never really followed up on their son's disappearance. I mean, Day4.wmv was seen by millions of people over the last 15 years. If a kid just suddenly up and disappeared from his college dorm, and he left a recording of his last thoughts and actions on the internet, then within the story itself, why wouldn't his parents or members of 4chan report this to law enforcement? Now, the reason why this could be hand-waved in the original story was because the investigation wouldn't have gone any further than Deducible's posts. You can't prosecute a haunted game cartridge. The same is true somewhat for the Doomsday Cult. You couldn't prove definitively that they were responsible for Deducible's disappearance for two reasons. First, they were also being haunted by Ben. And second, they didn't know anything about the creepypasta or Majora's Mask. There's some level of plausible deniability that shielded the cult from being held liable. And besides, either Ben or the cult leader could literally rewind time. No progress would have been made investigating them. However, if law enforcement were able to link the cartridge back to some shady corporation experimenting in soul digitization, then that's a whole other story. The only plausible reason why the Eternity Project wouldn't face any sort of repercussions is if they were funded by or in bed with the US government. And even then, you would still have to worry about whistleblowers. I mean, that's literally the plot of Outlast right there. You can't keep a lid on something this corrupt. And it's not just Deducible's disappearance. This change in the story recontextualizes a ton of shit for better or worse. The most egregious example is the old man that gave Deducible the cartridge in the first place. Does this mean he was part of the organization now? I mean, it was already cliche that this random old man was in possession of a haunted video game. But now you expect me to believe that instead, it was a highly advanced game cartridge designed to trap souls. Get the fuck out of here, man. Personally, I think it would have been more satisfying if the old man was the cult leader. It's a plot twist that would have made sense given just how fucking weird he was in the original creepypasta. And it would have opened the door for the story to expand beyond Majora's Mask, which is easily the story's biggest constraint. I mean, you can see in Alex's writing that he wanted to branch out from the haunted cartridge, but he just couldn't commit to it for one reason or another, and his audience only wanted to see more of the corrupted game footage. It's just... this thing's a fucking headache. Overall, the Awakening arc is definitely the weakest arc in the trilogy. While I'm sure this part of the story has its fans, I wouldn't consider myself to be one of them. It's a far cry from the classic creepypasta that kickstarted this entire journey, which brings us back to why I made this video. Throughout the last... oh Jesus, this was a long one. Okay, look, I'm just gonna cut to the chase. I didn't think I would yap this long, and I don't want to waste any more time. I think for a given piece of art to ultimately be a classic, it needs to have stuck with the majority of people that have consumed it. It's a popular vote, basically, and it functions like a less formal version of the term masterpiece that could be applied without the need of formal debate and argumentation. It would explain why stories as awful as Sonic.exe or Jeff the Killer are still culturally significant today, and it would also explain why properties that have languished for decades can still be considered relevant. I mean, if a game like Fallout 3 can be deemed as demonstrably terrible by most critics, but can still be enjoyed and looked back on fondly by the majority of casual audiences, then it's probably safe to label it a classic. These stories at the end of the day are meaningful to a lot of people for one reason or another, and meaningful doesn't always mean that they're good. A classic can be considered overrated, and likewise, the opposite is true for an underappreciated work of art. Now you could argue that the term has become incredibly misused. After all, our definition from the beginning of the video is starkly different from the one that we've tried to carefully craft. I personally don't believe that the term has been misappropriated, but for the sake of debate, we'll entertain this idea for a moment. If I were someone like Mahler, my first response would probably be to say that the feelings of the viewer are irrelevant at the end of the day when it comes to the quality of a given work. And while I would agree with that, I think it misses the point of my argument. The case I've been trying to make throughout this video is that the term classic is basically a social construct that's separate from the intrinsic quality of a work of art. It's inherently subjective, and it's based on the majority of people's experience with a given piece of work. Furthermore, this definition implies that something can stop being a classic if it falls into obscurity, which is internally consistent with the arguments in this video. An example of a piece of art that's no longer seen as a classic would probably be something along the lines of Ruby or Sword Art Online. These properties each still have a following, but public reception towards these stories have declined greatly over the last decade. The reason for this is because they each have a tarnished legacy. In fact, their situations aren't too dissimilar to Jeff the Killer. However, the major difference between these stories and our old friend Jeffy Boy is that Jeff the Killer eventually received adaptations that greatly improved his reputation, such as the Morgue Files and the Posture Rewrite. And while attempts have been made to try and revitalize these properties, none of them have really succeeded. Nothing short of a reboot will be able to fix Ruby, and the online reception towards Dusk Queen more or less proves my point here. The same is true for Sword Art Online. It sorely needs an anime adaptation of the progressive light novels before a majority of people can feel comfortable engaging with the property again, because the original anime is just that awful. And this brings us back to the beginning of this video. Is Ben Drowned a classic? Well, for the time being, it's without a doubt a major touchstone in the online horror space. That much we can say for certain. But as for whether or not the story will have staying power in the next few decades, I think the Haunted Cartridge arc will hold the most cultural significance many years from now. Like I said earlier in the video, there are many stories on the internet that owe their existence to Ben Drowned. The level of showmanship and commitment that went into making the Haunted Cartridge arc feel so believable is something that writers and essayists will be studying for years to come. And I just can't say the same for either the Moonchildren arc or the Awakening arc. So yes, I do believe that Ben Drowned is a classic, but I think it's a label that can only be applied to this story's original run on 4chan. But who knows, I could be entirely wrong. There may come a time when Ben Drowned is no longer looked upon as a classic of this medium of horror storytelling. And when that day comes, I'm sure this story will fade into the background like many previous classics before it. But what matters at the end of the day is that it made its mark on the world, and that the online horror space is all the better for it. Thank you for watching. Friends, if you've enjoyed this video, then I highly implore you to check out my other stuff. If you want to keep up with all the latest updates on my channel, you can check out my community posts. I often run polls, post progress reports on my upcoming videos, upload previews of my upcoming work, and sometimes just share Yu-Gi-Oh decks I've made recently. I don't like using other social media websites because, frankly, they're fucking cesspools. And this way, I can familiarize myself with my audience without developing some parasocial relationship. This project was a little less crass than my normal long-form content. I haven't exactly written a proper essay like this since the Jeff the Killer video, but I'm sure these are videos that you would all enjoy. I had a lot of fun making them, and ultimately I do YouTube as a hobby, so I can promise you that I poured my heart into these videos. The playlist is on the screen for anyone who wants to check it out. As for my upcoming projects, the timeline for the next few months is currently on the screen. This is subject to change, but I'm going to try to stick to this as much as I can. I'm hoping you'll check them out when they finally drop, and I hope you guys stick around for the long haul. Remember to subscribe and click the bell, and I'll see you all in the next one.